from a personal point of view, the cross of Christ is a really difficult subject on an intellectual perspective. The Bible hints at a whole range of ways that we could think of how Christ's death is necessary for salvation, but they all fail to really meet the intellectual demand to understand it. And so it makes it very difficult to teach it. And I'm someone who loves to think. I like to plumb the depths as best I can and draw on as much of logical, rational, reasonable thinking to be able to create an argument or develop an idea so that people can see the logical connections. The thing is, when you start to talk about the cross of Christ, what's really, really hard to do is say the necessary thing, which is this, that the means and method of Christ's death, the crucifixion, the harrowing, humiliating, excruciating death of the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, was necessary so that we could be free. It's really hard to make that logical argument from that being necessary for us to be free. There are lots of ways in which, as I said, there are biblical metaphors for that and theological ways of thinking about it, and yet they just all slip away from our grasp. So when trying to deliver a talk, particularly from the way I like to approach things, which is to see the angles and to help explore different ways of thinking about something, when it comes to the cross, it really just cuts through all the thinking. It says, you just don't understand this, and you're not really ever going to totally understand this. You will have only a limited perspective, and you're going to have to live with that. I found that really, really hard, and I didn't really, for a long, long time, in fact, the sermon wasn't written until that Sunday morning. Quite literally, I did a whole bunch of work for 2 weeks leading up to it, but it wasn't until Sunday morning when I pulled it all together. That's not normally my way of doing things. I'm always thinking about it until the last minute, but to actually have to write it at the end, and to, in the end, need to read it, which again is something very rare for me, is evidence of just how hard that talk was to make. And the big part of that was the cross, as Paul said, to the Gentiles, to those who are born on rational philosophy and who like to think and to draw on wisdom. The cross of Christ is God's foolishness, and it defies our thinking, and it just has to. For it to be the cross of Christ and not my cross, it has to defy my ability to think it through, even as we are able to find some means of peering into this mystery. We will always be looking into it and recognizing that we're only seeing very limited elements of it. So that was the first part that was really hard about that particular talk. The second part that I found really hard was, again, just drawing on Paul here, when he was talking to the Corinthians, who in many ways they kind of represent a modern Western church. They have everything. They really are suckered into the super apostle way of doing things. They love convincing preachers. We love the flashy stuff. We have all the wealth. We are the Corinthians in the modern Western church have a lot in common. And Paul was very determined and clear when he said to them, look, I came to you determined to know only one thing, and that was Christ and him crucified. And he goes on and says, I came to you in weakness and foolishness and trembling. And I think that those two things are related. I think that is the nature of the message, Christ and him crucified, that leaves a preacher in that position. That there's partly because, as I just said, you can't deliver a really rational thought. You have to rely on the fact that there is power in this story, that there is a Spirit of God working in the story in some mysterious way, and telling the story and trying to draw attention only to Christ and him crucified. A story that makes no sense, that doesn't have any easy rational handholds to grip onto. You have to come in humility, you have to come in weakness, you have to come in fear and trembling, knowing that people will easily say, that is a stupid thing to say. That makes no sense. Because it doesn't make any sense. or at least it doesn't make enough sense to be convincing. The only thing you can rely on is, as he said, the power of God, that in fact, if you had a rationale in an argument, you would in fact be emptying the cross of Christ of its power to convict and arrest our attention and hit our heart at a level that only the heart knows it can be hit at, beyond rational thinking, to a point where God says, this is true, and you need to understand that you have to come in humility before the cross. But the preacher has to start there too. The preacher has to come in humility, has to come knowing that there is going to be a risky reception to this very risky story. Or as Paul again, he said, I am not ashamed of the gospel. And he's talking about the reality that was true then and true now, that the story of the cross is a story of shame, that the God we call immortal, omnipresent, omnipotent, has in fact emptied himself of power and prestige and position and influence, has emptied himself of his right to immortality. Christ emptied himself of everything in order to be subjected to all of the horrors that we are subjected to, including death. There's no sensible, rational, shameless way of telling that story. It's just ridiculous. So you have to come in fear and trembling and weakness. And in fact, you have to bring yourself into that as well. And I tried to do that to reveal the way in which the Christ on that cross places me in a position of humility and humiliation as well. I am not the pastor I wished I was. I'm not the Christian I wished I was. I am, like Paul said, there's this, someone pointed out the journey that Paul took within the scriptures of his self-definition. He begins with that, I'm the least of the apostles. And then he goes on and says, I am the least among the brethren. And then finally he says, I'm the worst of all sinners. There is something about growing closer and closer to Christ that leads us in a deeper awareness of just how far from Christ we really are. That the gap widens the closer Christ gets to us. Now that's a paradox too, but it's true. I've experienced that as well. I've journeyed with Christ closely and bore a particular cross for many years now. And it hasn't made me feel like a better Christian. It's made me feel like a worse Christian, not in a condemning way, just in a way of seeing myself more properly. And of course, when I see myself more properly, I'm allowing Christ to speak to that person that he has always known and seen. And he says, Philip, I love you. When you feel that you are least loved, and that's when God says you are loved, you're totally accepted, you are mine, it can really sink in deep in a way that when you think you're okay, the message of you are okay just doesn't take hold. Why should it? So that's the other part that I found really, really hard about the message, my vulnerability and having to give it that way and be part of that story, in keeping with the nature of that story of humiliation really, and shame. So the final reflection I wanted to give on the challenge of preaching the cross relates to a statement that I drew on for the talk out of a book called Theology of the Cross by Jürgen Moltmann, where he said that in a comfortable society, a theology of glory will always displace the theology of the cross. Comfortable Christianity is a little bit of an anathema to a Christianity that is defined by the contorted face and body of a crucified Christ for our sake. It's very hard to look at Christ and him crucified and be content with our comforts and be content with our ease and the lack of struggle in our faith. So what displaces that is the theology of glory, which essentially is to say we are to skip quickly past the crucifixion and get on to the resurrection. Paul faced this very issue within the Corinthian church. Essentially, they thought that they had got onto the resurrected life and could leave the dying to sin thing behind. Christ did that for them, and they could now live in a glory life, the resurrected life. And Paul was kind of like, well, hang on, how is it that I, the one who is bringing this message to you, have to live this life where I don't get supported, I've been beaten, I've been whipped, I've been shipwrecked? his second letter to the Corinthians is full of his CV, his apostleship CV, which is just a list of humiliating things he's had to endure in bearing this message. How is it that's my reality, but you think that you're beyond that? You think that you, who have just inherited what I've been passing on, what I determined to know among you, which was only Christ and Him crucified, you think you've moved on to Christ and Him resurrected, and you don't have to live the crucified life. How is it I do, but you don't? That is the challenge to a modern Western church too, because the theology of glory simply says something like, it's the word of faith movement, that we're not supposed to be sitting in the Garden of Gethsemane crying out, I don't want to suffer, I want my way, but nevertheless, I will have your will in my life rather than mine. Well, the word of faith movement would not have that Christ. The word of faith movement would be, well, Christ, in that garden, you should trust the Lord and pray and speak into being your escape from the cross. That's the mountain that your seed of faith should be casting into the waters. The word of faith movement has nothing and little to do with Christ and Him crucified. It has everything to do with, let's get to the glory part. Our lovely homes, and our lovely cars, and our wonderful reputations, and our sparkling appearances, and our nice clean clothes, and all of those things that kind of lack and are lacking in the Christ on the cross, who has no home, He has no clothes, He has no friends, He has no reputation. All of the things that we abhor are the things that exist in that image. Unsurprising then that preaching that to a wealthy middle class congregation is always going to be hard. And in that sense too, maybe the final word is, it was hard because it's preaching to me. It's a conviction on my heart. It's the cross over my life, sitting in this nice home, speaking to an iPhone, about to download into a laptop and send it to YouTube. I have the ability to do this because I am privileged. I have privileges, I have advantages that many, many, many don't have. And it would be very easy for me to stand on my high horse and wag the finger at the word of faith movement or any other theology of glory movement, but I may not aspire or preach that or believe it to be anything less than a way of shipwrecking our faith. Nevertheless, the reality is I probably live that way, believing that I should have good things, not bad things, that I should escape harm and not suffer a cross. So the cross it comes for us all if we really want to be believers of Christ and followers of Christ. For after it was His words that were, if you want to save your life, you're going to have to lose it for my sake. That whoever wants to follow me have to take up their cross. That's the reality. That's where it lands. So may God be with us, as I'm sure He is, and peace be with you. Anyway, see you soon. Bye.